Hey guys, tonight we begin with Viking feasts. And trust me, you're about to discover that everything you think you know about Nordic dinner parties is hilariously wrong. These weren't just burly men chugging mead from horns while gnawing on turkey legs like some medieval Renaissance fair fever dream. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into the surprisingly sophisticated and occasionally disgusting world of Viking dining etiquette. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Viking feasts. Most people picture bearded warriors ripping apart whole roasted animals with their bare hands, belching loudly and drinking themselves into stupors while wenches serve them endless platters of meat. In reality, Viking feasts were elaborate social performances with strict etiquette rules, complex giving protocols, and dining customs that would make a modern sommelier weep with envy. Think less barbarian food fight and more Game of Thrones dinner party, but with better personal hygiene and more passive-aggressive poetry competitions. This wasn't some testosterone-fueled meat carnival where social graces went to die. It was a carefully orchestrated political theater where your table manners could literally determine whether you lived to see another sunrise and where the wrong toast could start a blood feud that lasted generations. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, was a time when Scandinavian society wasn't the egalitarian paradise your local Renaissance fair might suggest. It was a rigidly hierarchical world where your seat at the feast table announced your social status louder than a medieval Instagram post. Medieval Scandinavia wasn't some frozen wasteland populated by illiterate barbarians. It was a sophisticated network of kingdoms, trade routes, and cultural exchanges that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. The chieftains and jarls who hosted these feasts controlled not just land and warriors, but the intricate web of alliances, debts, and obligations that held their communities together. And the consequences of a poorly executed feast could range from social humiliation to actual warfare. If you thought Vikings were just raiders who occasionally took breaks from pillaging to wolf down some mutton, think again. These feasts were the backbone of their entire political system. A successful feast could cement alliances, arrange marriages, settle disputes, and even prevent wars, while a failed one could destroy reputations, break treaties, and send guests home plotting revenge. The great halls where these feasts took place weren't just dining rooms. They were courtrooms, temples, theaters, and diplomatic embassies all rolled into one smoky, meat-soaked package. And if you think modern dinner party planning is stressful, imagine knowing that serving the wrong cut of meat to the wrong person could result in your entire family being declared outlaws and hunted across 3 kingdoms. Enter Egil Skallagrimsson, the 10th century Viking poet, warrior, and professional dinner guest from hell. This guy wasn't just your average feast attendee. He was a walking PR nightmare who combined the social skills of a honey badger with the poetic talents of Shakespeare and the temper of a caffeinated wolverine. Egil had a reputation for showing up to feasts uninvited, insulting his hosts in elaborate verse, and somehow managing to leave alive despite behavior that should have gotten him killed before dessert was served. But here's the twist. Egil was actually following established Viking feast protocol. His outrageous behavior wasn't random chaos. It was a carefully calculated performance designed to test his hosts, establish his own reputation, and navigate the complex social dynamics of medieval Scandinavian politics. One famous incident involved Egil attending a feast where he was served what he considered subpar ale, so he composed and recited an insulting poem about his host's brewing skills that was so devastatingly clever that instead of having him executed, everyone applauded and demanded an encore. This wasn't just drunken poetry slam behavior. It was sophisticated psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. Egil understood that at Viking feasts, wit was as important as warfare, and that the right insult delivered with perfect timing could be more valuable than a sword thrust. His ability to compose cutting verse on the spot while maintaining the delicate balance between entertainment and offense made him, simultaneously, the most feared and most desired guest in medieval Scandinavia. And if you think that's impressive, wait until you hear about the actual rules governing who could sit where at these elaborate dinner parties. This wasn't just about getting together for a nice meal and some drinks. Viking feasts were the social, media, stock exchange, and Supreme Court of medieval Scandinavia, all wrapped into one alcohol-fueled evening. These gatherings determined marriage alliances that could unite kingdoms, trade agreements that controlled entire economies and military pacts that decided the fate of nations. The wrong gesture, the incorrect toast, or sitting in the wrong seat could trigger feuds that would span generations and leave entire families destroyed. Who was affected? Everyone from the lowliest servant to the mightiest king participated in this intricate social dance, and everyone had something to lose. A successful feast could elevate a minor chieftain to royal status, while a poorly managed one could reduce a powerful jarl to a laughingstock whose own warriors would abandon him. This mattered then because it was literally how Viking society functioned. No central government, no formal legal system. Just an elaborate network of personal relationships maintained through carefully orchestrated dinner parties. And it matters now because it reveals just how sophisticated and complex these supposedly primitive societies actually were. But Egil's legendary dinner party antics were just the beginning of this wild world of Viking feast culture. The actual preparation for these events made modern wedding planning look like child's play, and the social protocols made diplomatic summits seem casual. Let's dive deeper into this delicious madness. The elaborate preparation and social protocols of Viking feasts made modern diplomatic dinners look like casual barbecues. Unlike the popular image of Vikings spontaneously deciding to throw a party and just roasting whatever animal happened to be wandering nearby, these events required months of planning, armies of servants, and a level of logistical coordination that would impress a modern wedding planner. The historical context for this obsessive attention to detail wasn't just Viking perfectionism. It was pure survival instinct wrapped in social customs. These preparation rituals developed because in a society without written contracts, formal governments, or reliable legal systems, your reputation was literally your life insurance policy. A poorly executed feast didn't just mean embarrassment. It could mean political isolation, economic ruin, and in extreme cases, actual assassination. Attempts from guests who felt disrespected. So Viking hosts approached feast planning with the same intensity that modern nations approach nuclear disarmament treaties. The process began weeks or even months in advance, with hosts dispatching messengers across vast distances to formally invite guests, negotiate safe passage agreements, and coordinate the complex logistics of moving entire retinues across dangerous terrain. These weren't casual, "Hey, want to come over for dinner?" invitations. They were formal diplomatic communications that specified everything from the number of armed retainers each guest could bring to the exact gifts that would be expected during the evening ceremonies. But here's where it gets really interesting. The invitation itself was a form of psychological warfare. The language used, the messenger chosen, the timing of the delivery, and even the quality of the parchment all sent subtle signals about the host's intentions, resources, and opinion of the invited guest. A hastily delivered invitation on cheap materials was essentially a diplomatic insult, while an elaborately crafted invitation delivered by a high-ranking messenger was a sign of respect that the recipient would be expected to reciprocate during the actual feast. Getting this wrong was like showing up to a black tie event in flip-flops. Except instead of just looking foolish, you might accidentally declare war on your neighbors. Take the legendary feast hosted by Earl Håkon of Norway in 985 CE, which required a full 6 months of preparation and nearly bankrupted 3 separate kingdoms. Håkon wasn't just throwing a dinner party, he was orchestrating what medieval chroniclers described as the most magnificent display of wealth and power ever witnessed in the north. The preparations began with Håkon's servants traveling to Iceland specifically to acquire a particular type of whale oil that burned with a sweet scent, to Ireland for specially bred pigs that had been fed on acorns and honey, and to the Byzantine Empire for silk hangings that cost more than most people's annual income. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. Håkon's feast required over 200 cattle, 500 sheep, 1,000 chickens, and enough grain to feed a small army for months. But this wasn't just about quantity. Every single ingredient had to meet specific quality standards that were enforced by professional tasters, whose job was literally to sample everything and ensure it met the host's exacting standards. One contemporary account describes a servant being flogged because he allowed slightly overripe berries to be included in a sauce, not because they were inedible, but because serving subpar ingredients to important guests was considered a grave insult. The seating arrangements alone required weeks of negotiation and careful diplomatic maneuvering. Viking feast seating wasn't just about comfort. It was a public declaration of social hierarchy, political alliances, and personal relationships that every guest would analyze for hidden meanings. Håkon's feast included over 300 guests each, of whom had to be seated according to their rank, their relationship to the host, their current political standing, and their potential usefulness in future endeavors. Get this wrong, and you could accidentally start a blood feud by seating someone's enemy in a position of higher honor. One particularly dramatic incident involved 2 rival jarls who both claimed the right to sit at Håkon's right hand, a position that carried enormous symbolic weight. Rather than risk offending either guest by choosing between them, Håkon had his craftsman build a special table extension that technically gave both jarls equal proximity to the host position. This solution was so diplomatically clever that it became the subject of praise poems for decades afterward, with skalds composing elaborate verses celebrating Håkon's wisdom in avoiding what could have been a politically disastrous situation. But perhaps most impressive was the entertainment coordination. Håkon hired professional storytellers from across Scandinavia, each specializing in different types of performances. Some told heroic sagas, others recited genealogies that traced guest lineages back to legendary figures, and still others performed comedy acts that had to be carefully calibrated to mock people who weren't present while flattering those who were. One skald allegedly spent 3 months composing a single praise poem about a guest's ancestor, complete with historically accurate details and subtle references to current political situations that would demonstrate both his learning and his loyalty to his patron. The gift-giving protocols were equally complex. Each guest was expected to bring presents appropriate to their status and relationship with the host, while the host was obligated to reciprocate with gifts of equal or greater value. Håkon's record keepers maintained detailed lists of every gift given and received, because failing to reciprocate appropriately could be interpreted as either arrogance or poverty, both potentially fatal social mistakes. The gifts themselves ranged from practical items like weapons and tools to exotic luxuries like amber jewelry and imported spices, with the most prestigious presents being custom-made items that demonstrated the giver's wealth and the recipient's importance. But it wasn't that simple, because Viking feast culture was riddled with contradictions that would make a modern etiquette expert weep in frustration. The same society that insisted on elaborate preparation rituals also celebrated spontaneous displays of generosity that could completely upend carefully planned protocols. A host who stuck too rigidly to predetermined arrangements risked being seen as stingy or unimaginative, while one who improvised too much could be viewed as disorganized or disrespectful. Complicating factors included the fact that different regions had varying customs, meaning that a gesture considered polite in Denmark might be insulting in Norway, and what passed for acceptable behavior in Iceland could cause a diplomatic incident in Sweden. Hosts had to navigate these cultural differences while maintaining their own local traditions, creating a complex web of competing expectations that required constant improvisation and careful judgment. Contradictory evidence from surviving sources shows that some feasts were indeed the raucous, chaotic affairs of popular imagination, but these were typically either celebrations of military victories, religious festivals, or deliberate displays of contempt for social conventions. The archaeological record reveals both elaborately set tables with expensive imported dishware and crude eating areas where food was apparently consumed directly from communal pots, suggesting that feast formality varied dramatically depending on the occasion and participants. Different perspectives from contemporary sources paint wildly varying pictures of the same events. Christian chroniclers, who viewed pagan feast culture through the lens of religious disapproval, emphasized the drunkenness, violence, and what they saw as barbaric behavior. Meanwhile, indigenous Scandinavian sources, like the sagas, celebrate the same behaviors as examples of heroic excess and proper masculine conduct. Islamic travelers who witnessed Viking feasts wrote about them as exotic curiosities, focusing on aspects that seemed strange to their own cultural background. Why the situation was more complex than it appears is that Viking society was undergoing rapid change during the feast period we're discussing. Traditional pagan customs were increasingly coming into conflict with Christian influences. Trade relationships were introducing new luxury goods and foreign customs, and political consolidation was creating larger kingdoms with more formalized court cultures. This meant that feast protocols were constantly evolving, with older customs being modified, abandoned, or deliberately maintained as symbols of cultural resistance. A modern analogy would be trying to navigate dinner party etiquette during a period when your society's fundamental values, religious beliefs, and political systems were all changing simultaneously. You'd never be sure whether to follow traditional rules, adopt new customs, or create hybrid approaches that honored both old and new ways of doing things. The result was a feast culture that could make or break entire dynasties, depending on how successfully hosts managed these competing pressures and contradictory expectations. Political careers were launched by legendary feasts that demonstrated a host's wisdom, wealth, and diplomatic skills, while others were destroyed by events that went wrong in spectacular and sometimes fatal ways. The ripple effects of a single feast could influence marriage negotiations, trade agreements, and military alliances for decades afterward. Who was affected extended far beyond the immediate guests and hosts. Successful feasts required the labor of hundreds of servants, craftspeople, entertainers, and suppliers, creating economic opportunities that could lift entire communities. Failed feasts, conversely, could bankrupt not just the host, but also the merchants, farmers, and artisans who had invested their resources in the event's success. The economic impact of major feasts was substantial enough to influence regional trade patterns and seasonal labor. Markets taught how people responded to feast. Culture varied dramatically based on their social position and personal circumstances. Wealthy hosts embraced the competitive aspects, constantly seeking to outdo rivals with more elaborate displays of hospitality. Poorer community members often found themselves caught between the desire to participate in this prestigious social activity and the financial reality that a single failed feast attempt could destroy their family's economic prospects for generations. Institutional reactions were equally complex. The emerging Christian church initially opposed feast culture as pagan and excessive, but gradually learned to work within the system, with some bishops becoming renowned for their own diplomatic dinner parties that combined Christian symbolism with traditional hospitality customs. Royal courts began incorporating feast protocols into their formal ceremonial procedures, creating standardized rules that could be applied across different regions and situations. Long-term implications included the gradual evolution of Viking feast culture into the more formalized court cultures of medieval European kingdoms. Many of the diplomatic, economic, and social functions originally served by these informal gatherings were eventually absorbed into official government institutions. But the underlying importance of hospitality and personal relationships in Nordic political culture persisted for centuries. The most fascinating aspect was how feast culture served as a bridge between the informal, clan-based societies of early Viking Age Scandinavia and the more centralized monarchies that emerged during the later medieval period. Feasts provided a framework for testing and refining the social skills, economic strategies, and political insights that successful leaders would need as their societies became more complex and interconnected. Meanwhile, while hosts were wrestling with these impossible protocols and guests were trying to decode the subtle meanings behind every gesture, an entirely different drama was unfolding in the kitchens and preparation areas where the actual food was being created. The connection between what happened behind the scenes and what appeared on the tables reveals another layer of complexity that makes modern restaurant operations look simple by comparison. If you thought the social protocols were complicated, wait until you hear about the actual cooking processes, food preservation techniques, and culinary innovations that made these elaborate feasts possible in an era without refrigeration, standardized measurements, or reliable supply chains. The kitchen staff weren't just preparing meals, they were performing culinary magic tricks that required skills passed down through generations and knowledge that was closely guarded. Trade secrets. But the most fascinating aspect was how the food itself became a form of communication, with every dish, every ingredient choice, and even every cooking method sending specific messages to guests about the host's intentions, resources, and cultural sophistication. A single meal could include coded references to historical events, subtle compliments to important guests, and even veiled threats to potential enemies, all expressed through the language of cuisine rather than words. This culinary complexity building anticipation for the next layer of our story, where we'll explore how Viking cooks managed to create elaborate multi-course meals that were simultaneously delicious, politically meaningful, and logistically miraculous. If the social protocols of Viking feasts were elaborate political theater, then the actual culinary operations were nothing short of medieval engineering marvels disguised as dinner preparation. The kitchens where these feasts were created weren't just cooking spaces. They were complex industrial operations that would make modern restaurant chains weep with envy at their efficiency and innovation. This became important because in a world without refrigeration, canned goods, or reliable transportation, feeding hundreds of guests, a multi-course meal that was both delicious and safe required techniques that bordered on alchemy. Unlike our modern assumption that medieval cooking was just throw meat over fire and hope for the best, Viking feast preparation involved sophisticated preservation methods, complex seasoning combinations, and cooking techniques that were closely guarded professional secrets passed down through generations of master cooks. These culinary professionals weren't just servants following simple recipes. They were skilled artisans whose knowledge of food chemistry, flavor combinations, and presentation techniques made them among the most valuable members of any noble household. The context for this culinary sophistication was purely practical survival. A host who served spoiled food didn't just face social embarrassment. They could literally poison their guests, which was considered one of the most heinous crimes in Viking society and could result in immediate execution or permanent outlawry. So feast cooks developed preservation and preparation methods that were essentially early food science, using fermentation, smoking, salt curing, and herb combinations that could keep food fresh for weeks while enhancing its flavor. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The food itself became a sophisticated communication system. Every ingredient choice, every seasoning combination, and every presentation method carried specific cultural meanings that guests were expected to recognize and interpret. Serving honey-roasted pork might be a compliment to a guest's Danish heritage, while offering fermented shark could be either a gesture of respect for Icelandic traditions or a subtle insult, depending on how it was prepared and presented. Why this developed was that in a largely oral culture where written records were rare and literacy was limited to a small elite, food became one of the primary ways to communicate complex social, political, and cultural messages. A skilled feast cook could convey more information about their host's intentions and relationships through a single meal than most people could express in hours of conversation. This culinary communication system was so sophisticated that some Viking cooks were essentially edible poets, creating meals that told stories, honored ancestors, and negotiated political relationships through the language of taste and presentation. Consider the legendary culinary masterpiece created by Thorhild the cook for King Olaf Tryggvason's Yuletide feast in 999 CE, an event that Norse chroniclers described as a meal that spoke louder than swords and tasted better than victory. Thorhild wasn't just any cook. She was a culinary genius whose innovations in food preservation and flavor combination made her one of the most sought-after professionals in medieval Scandinavia. Kings literally went to war over the right to employ her services, and her recipes were considered state secrets, worthy of diplomatic protection. The background to this particular feast was politically explosive. King Olaf was attempting to convert Norway to Christianity, and his Yuletide celebration needed to honor both traditional Norse customs and his new Christian beliefs without offending either pagans or Christians among his guests. The challenge was creating a menu that would satisfy everyone while sending clear messages about the king's political and religious intentions. Thorhild's solution was a culinary diplomatic masterstroke that used food symbolism to bridge the gap between competing belief systems. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Thorhild created a 12-course meal where each dish represented a different month of the year, combining traditional Norse ingredients with Christian symbolism in ways that honored both traditions. The centerpiece was a massive roasted boar that had been fed on apples and honey for months before slaughter, then prepared using a smoking technique that incorporated both sacred juniper, valued by Norse pagans, and frankincense, important to Christians. The result was a dish that tasted divine while simultaneously honoring both religious traditions. But the real genius was in the details. Thorhild prepared what appeared to be traditional Norse blood sausage, but instead of using pig's blood, she created a convincing substitute using beets, barley, and secret spice combinations that gave it the proper color and texture, while remaining acceptable to Christian dietary restrictions. When Norse traditionalists praised the blood sausage and Christian guests appreciated the vegetarian offering, both groups felt their beliefs had been respected, without either realizing they were eating the same dish. The key players in this culinary drama included not just Thorhild herself, but an entire network of specialized suppliers, preservation experts, and presentation artists who worked together to create what was essentially an elaborate food-based performance. Each cook specialized in different techniques. One was a master of fermentation, who could create alcoholic beverages that ranged from barely fermented ale to potent spirits that could strip paint, while another specialized in smoking techniques that could preserve meat for months while infusing it with complex flavor profiles. The drama and conflict arose when a rival cook, jealous of Thorhild's success, attempted to sabotage the feast by introducing spoiled ingredients into one of the courses. This wasn't just petty kitchen rivalry. Food sabotage was considered an act of treason that could justify immediate execution. Thorhild discovered the sabotage through her sophisticated quality control methods. She tested every ingredient personally and maintained detailed records of all food sources, and the resulting scandal became the subject of several surviving sagas that celebrate her professional integrity and skill. The resolution was both dramatic and diplomatically elegant. Rather than publicly exposing the saboteur and creating a scene that would disrupt the feast, Thorhild quietly removed a contaminated course and replaced it with an improvised dish that was so delicious the guests praised it as the highlight of the meal. She then privately informed King Olaf of the attempted sabotage, allowing him to deal with the traitor discreetly while maintaining the festive atmosphere. The immediate aftermath was that Thorhild's reputation for both culinary skill and political wisdom made her even more valuable, while the would-be saboteur disappeared from historical records in a way that suggests their career ended permanently, and probably painfully. The broader significance of this incident was that it demonstrated how Viking feast culture had evolved beyond simple hospitality into a sophisticated form of statecraft where culinary professionals were essentially diplomatic agents whose skills could make or break international relations. Thorhild's success at the Yuletide feast helped legitimize King Olaf's religious conversion efforts while maintaining social stability during a period of potentially explosive cultural transition. Her techniques for combining competing traditions through food became a model that other rulers would try to replicate, though few achieved her level of success in balancing conflicting interests through culinary diplomacy. This wasn't an isolated incident. Successful Viking feast cooks across Scandinavia were developing similar techniques for using food as a diplomatic tool during periods of cultural and political transition. Archaeological evidence from feast sites across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden reveals consistent patterns in cooking equipment, ingredient storage, and food preparation areas that suggest these culinary innovations were being shared and refined throughout the Viking world. Other examples include the legendary cook Astrid Ironladle, whose specialty was creating dishes that could feed enormous crowds. While maintaining consistent quality, she allegedly developed techniques for cooking whole oxen that ensured every guest received perfectly prepared meat, regardless of their position in the serving order. Then there was Magnus the Spice Master, who established trade relationships with merchants from as far away as India and China, specifically to acquire exotic seasonings that would make his dishes memorable and unique. The pattern that emerges is that successful Viking feast cooks were essentially running sophisticated businesses that combined culinary skill with international trade, diplomatic intelligence, and technological innovation. They maintained networks of suppliers that spanned continents, developed preservation techniques that allowed them to store exotic ingredients for months, and created presentation methods that turned meals into memorable experiences that guests would discuss for years afterward. Why this pattern existed was that in Viking society, reputation was everything, and a host's reputation depended heavily on the quality of their feasts. This created a competitive environment where cooks were constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible with available ingredients and technology. The social, political, and economic factors that drove this innovation included the need to impress increasingly sophisticated guests, the desire to demonstrate wealth and power through conspicuous consumption, and the practical requirement to feed large groups safely in an era without modern food safety knowledge. Comparison to other time periods reveals that Viking feast culture was remarkably advanced for its era. While contemporary Byzantine and Islamic courts had access to more exotic ingredients and larger populations of skilled cooks, Viking culinary professionals were innovating techniques for food preservation, flavor combination, and large-scale food preparation that wouldn't be matched in other European cultures for centuries. Their methods for smoking fish, fermenting dairy products, and preserving vegetables through controlled fermentation were more sophisticated than techniques used in many other medieval societies. The pattern also reveals how Viking feast culture served as a bridge between the simple subsistence cooking of earlier periods and the more elaborate court cuisines that would develop in later medieval Europe. Many techniques pioneered by Viking feast cooks, including specific methods for roasting large animals, creating complex fermented beverages, and preserving seasonal ingredients, would eventually influence cooking traditions throughout Northern Europe and beyond. The effects of this culinary innovation were far-reaching and often unexpected, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants in Viking feast culture. Who benefited most obviously were the cooks themselves, whose specialized skills made them valuable enough to command high wages, international recognition, and protection from powerful patrons. But the benefits extended to entire supply chains of farmers, hunters, fishermen, and traders who found new markets for their products and incentives to improve quality and develop new varieties of ingredients. The economic impact was substantial. Archaeological evidence suggests that the demand for feast-quality ingredients drove agricultural innovations throughout Scandinavia, with farmers developing new breeds of livestock, experimenting with crop varieties, and creating specialized production techniques designed to meet the exacting standards of professional feast cooks. Some regions became known for specific products, certain Norwegian fjords for their salmon, particular Danish islands for their pork, specific Swedish forests for their game, creating early forms of what we might recognize today as protected geographical designations. Who suffered were primarily those who couldn't adapt to the increasingly sophisticated demands of feast culture. Traditional cooks, whose skills were limited to basic survival cooking, found themselves displaced by professionals with advanced techniques and international connections. Small-scale food producers who couldn't meet quality standards or volume requirements were pushed out of lucrative feast supply contracts, sometimes leading to economic hardship for entire communities. Unintended consequences included the development of what was essentially an early form of industrial espionage, as rival cooks attempted to steal recipes, preservation techniques, and supplier relationships from their competitors. Some of the surviving sagas describe elaborate schemes involving disguised apprentices, bribed servants, and even what appear to be early forms of corporate sabotage, as different cooking professionals tried to maintain competitive advantages in an increasingly cutthroat market. How this shaped future developments was profound and lasting. The preservation techniques developed by Viking feast cooks contributed to Scandinavian maritime success by making it possible to provision ships for long voyages with food that remained edible and nutritious for months at sea. The fermentation methods they perfected influenced brewing and cheese-making traditions that persist in Scandinavia today. Their innovations in large-scale food preparation helped lay the groundwork for the more elaborate court cuisines that would develop as Viking societies evolved into medieval kingdoms. Modern parallels include the way contemporary celebrity chefs leverage media attention and international supply chains to build culinary empires, or how modern food science applies chemistry and biology to solve preservation and flavor challenges. The competitive dynamics between Viking feast cooks resembled modern restaurant industry rivalries, complete with trade secrets, staff poaching, and publicity wars fought through culinary innovation rather than advertising campaigns. The lessons from this period demonstrate how culinary innovation often drives broader technological and social changes, and how food culture can serve as both a reflection of existing social structures and a catalyst for social transformation. Viking feast cooks were essentially running early versions of what we might recognize today as lifestyle brands, using food to communicate complex messages about identity, values, and social relationships. Yet even as these culinary professionals were revolutionizing food preparation and turning meals into sophisticated communication systems, the actual dynamics playing out in the great halls during these feasts were reaching levels of drama and complexity that made the kitchen innovations look simple by comparison. The connection between what happened behind the scenes in food preparation and what unfolded during the actual feast events reveals how Viking society had created an entertainment ecosystem where every element, from the first course to the final toast, was designed to test, challenge, and sometimes deliberately provoke the guest's thought while cooks were busy encoding political messages into menu choices and perfecting preservation techniques. The guests themselves were engaging in their own forms of competitive performance that could make or break reputations, determine political alliances, and occasionally result in actual bloodshed before the evening was over. The peak drama of Viking feasts wasn't just about the food. It was about the explosive combination of alcohol, ego, political ambition, and social competition that turned every gathering into a potential powder keg of interpersonal conflict. But the most fascinating aspect was how these various elements, the elaborate preparation, the sophisticated cuisine, and the volatile social dynamics, combined to create events that were simultaneously magnificent spectacles and genuine diplomatic crises. The stage was set for confrontations that would become legendary, misunderstandings that would spawn decades-long feuds, and moments of brilliant improvisation that would be celebrated in poetry for generations. The real drama was just beginning. By the late 10th century, Viking feast culture had reached a breaking point where the combination of elaborate social protocols, competitive drinking, and barely contained political tensions had transformed these gatherings into social dynamite, waiting for the right spark to explode. The situation had evolved from sophisticated dinner parties into elaborate tests of courage, wit, and self-control that were designed to push participants to their absolute limits. The description of tensions at these events reads like a medieval version of reality television, if reality TV involved actual weapons and the possibility of starting international wars over seating arrangements. The problems were systemic and inevitable. As Viking society became more politically centralized and economically complex, the stakes involved in feast culture had grown exponentially, while the basic format remained rooted in earlier, simpler traditions that assumed smaller groups and less complicated political relationships. Key players now included not just local chieftains and their immediate followers, but representatives from multiple kingdoms, competing religious factions, rival trade networks, and ambitious individuals, whose personal agendas often conflicted with their official loyalties. The stakes involved were no longer just personal reputation or local political influence. They had escalated to include international diplomatic relationships, major trade agreements, religious conversions that could affect entire populations, and military alliances that could determine the outcome of wars involving thousands of warriors. A single misunderstood gesture or poorly timed insult could now trigger diplomatic crises that would require months of negotiation to resolve, assuming they could be resolved at all without resorting to actual warfare. What made the situation particularly explosive was that Viking feast culture had always celebrated precisely the kinds of bold, provocative behavior that were most likely to cause diplomatic incidents. The same traditions that encourage guests to display their courage through drinking contests, demonstrate their wit through cutting poetry, and prove their status through elaborate gift-giving were now playing out in contexts where the participants had the resources and motivation to turn social slights into actual military campaigns. The result was a feast culture that had become simultaneously more sophisticated and more dangerous, where the same event could feature exquisite culinary, artistry, and carefully choreographed entertainment alongside genuine threats of violence, political sabotage, and social destruction. Participants found themselves walking increasingly narrow lines between acceptable boldness and unforgivable offense, with the definition of acceptable changing depending on who was present, what political pressures they were under, and how much they had consumed of the increasingly potent alcoholic beverages that Viking feast culture had perfected. The most spectacular example of Viking feast culture exploding into chaos occurred at the infamous Stamford Bridge preliminary feast in 1066, hosted by Harold Hardrada just days before his disastrous invasion of England. This wasn't supposed to be a major political event. It was originally planned as a relatively modest gathering to finalize logistics and boost morale before the invasion. But Harold's decision to invite representatives from multiple allied factions, combined with his own reputation for dramatic gestures and the high-stakes nature of the impending military campaign, created a perfect storm of competing egos and political tensions. The build-up began innocuously enough, with Harold's usual attention to impressive hospitality. The hall was decorated with captured English banners and exotic treasures from his years as a mercenary in Byzantium. The feast tables groaned under the weight of specially imported delicacies, and the guest list included some of the most powerful and dangerous men in medieval Scandinavia. But the first sign of trouble came when two rival earls, Tostig Godwinson, the exiled English noble, and Eystein Orr, Harold's own brother-in-law, both arrived with larger-than-agreed-upon armed retinues and immediately began competing for the most prestigious seating positions. The key moment came during the traditional toast sequence, when each major guest was expected to stand and offer a formal tribute to the host's enterprise. The problem was that this particular enterprise, invading England, meant different things to different participants, and the toasts began revealing uncomfortable contradictions in their various motivations and expectations. Tostig's toast focused on reclaiming his rightful English earldom, implying that the invasion was primarily about restoring him to power. Eystein's response emphasized Harold's legitimate claim to the English throne, suggesting that Tostig's personal grievances were secondary to dynastic politics. But the real drama began when a relatively minor Norwegian jarl named Sigurd Thorson, apparently emboldened by several horns of mead, stood to offer what he described as a toast that speaks truth to power. Instead of the expected flattery, Sigurd launched into an improvised poem that questioned the wisdom of the entire English invasion, pointed out the military disadvantages they would face, and suggested that Harold's real motivation was personal vanity rather than legitimate political claims. The hall fell dead silent as Sigurd continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was essentially calling his king a fool in front of international eyes and military subordinates. Harold's response was a masterclass in political theater that somehow managed to be simultaneously brilliant and catastrophically stupid. Rather than simply having Sigurd executed for insubordination, which would have been the expected response, Harold stood and delivered an impromptu counterpoem that was so devastatingly witty and cutting that it reduced Sigurd to tears while simultaneously insulting half the other guests through clever wordplay and historical references. The poetry duel that followed became the stuff of legend, with other guests joining in to support their various patrons and allegiances. What should have been a simple Diplomatic exchange escalated into a competitive performance that lasted hours and involved increasingly personal attacks disguised as entertainment. Accusations were made about various guests' military competence, sexual behavior, religious sincerity, and family lineages, all delivered in the form of elaborate verse compositions that demonstrated literary skill while delivering devastating personal insults. The alcohol consumption, which had been heavy to begin with, accelerated as participants tried to maintain their wit and courage, while processing increasingly complex poetic attacks on their characters and reputations. The evening reached its climax when Tostig, apparently unable to tolerate further questions about his military abilities, challenged Eystein to single combat to settle their disagreements, like men rather than poets. This was exactly the kind of dramatic escalation that Viking feast culture was designed to prevent through elaborate social protocols. But those very protocols had created the competitive atmosphere that made such challenges almost inevitable. Harald's solution was both ingenious and ultimately tragic. Rather than allowing the combat or trying to defuse the situation through conventional diplomatic means, he declared that any man who wanted to fight could prove his courage in England rather than wasting it on fellow Vikings. He then immediately announced that the invasion would begin the next morning, rather than the originally planned departure date several days later. This decision was militarily disastrous. It meant abandoning careful logistical preparations and attacking before all the Allied forces had arrived. But it successfully redirected the aggressive energy that had been building in the hall toward an external target rather than internal conflict. The immediate aftermath was that everyone sobered up very quickly as they realized they now had to organize a major military expedition with almost no preparation time. The feast ended with frantic activity as guests rushed off to gather their forces and supplies, while Harald's household staff worked through the night to prepare for a departure that was now happening days ahead of schedule. The rivalry between Tostig and Eystein was temporarily set aside in favor of practical cooperation, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved and would continue to affect their military coordination during the invasion itself. The response to Harald's dramatic feast was immediate and far-reaching, demonstrating just how interconnected Viking political culture had become by the mid-11th century. Various parties' reactions revealed the complex web of relationships and expectations that made Viking feast culture so politically significant and so potentially dangerous. Allied chieftains who had been expecting several more days to prepare, their forces found themselves scrambling to meet the accelerated timeline, while some simply couldn't adjust quickly enough and missed the invasion entirely. Immediate consequences included not just the logistical chaos of premature departure, but also the diplomatic fallout from the feast's dramatic conclusion. Word of the evening's events spread rapidly through Scandinavia's extensive communication networks, carried by traders, travelers, and the various servants and minor nobles who had witnessed the proceedings. The story grew with each retelling, until Harald's feast became a legendary example of both royal magnificence and political volatility. The political fallout was substantial and long-lasting. Several potential allies reconsidered their support for Harald's invasion after hearing about the chaotic feast, reasoning that a king who couldn't control his own dinner guests might not be the best bet for a major military campaign. Others were impressed by Harald's ability to redirect internal conflict toward external conquest, interpreting his solution as evidence of political genius rather than improvised damage control. How this changed everything became clear during the invasion itself, which was plagued by coordination problems that can be traced directly back to the rushed departure from the feast. Units that should have been fighting together were scattered across different landing sites. Supply arrangements that had been carefully negotiated were abandoned in the hasty departure, and the various faction leaders spent as much time arguing about the feast's implications as they did planning military strategy. The ironic outcomes were numerous and tragic. Harold's attempt to prevent internal conflict through external warfare succeeded in the short term, but ultimately contributed to his death at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where poor coordination between his forces played a major role in their defeat. Tostig and Eystein, whose rivalry had triggered the crisis, both died in the same battle, making their feast-time competition literally pointless. The rushed invasion that was supposed to demonstrate Harold's decisiveness instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing social protocols to dictate military strategy. But perhaps most ironically, the feast became more famous than the invasion it was meant to celebrate. While the Battle of Stamford Bridge is remembered primarily by military historians, the dramatic events of Harald's feast were retold in poetry and saga literature for centuries, becoming a standard example of how Viking feast culture could simultaneously showcase political sophistication and create political disasters. The long-term effects extended far beyond the immediate participants. The story of Harald's feast became a cautionary tale that influenced how later Scandinavian rulers approached their own entertaining obligations, leading to more formalized protocols designed to prevent the kind of spontaneous competitive escalation that had derailed Harald's plans. Some rulers began employing professional entertainers and protocol managers, specifically to prevent their feast from devolving into poetry duels and personal combat challenges. This dramatic feast wasn't just an entertaining historical anecdote or a case study in medieval party planning gone wrong. It was a perfect example of how Viking feast culture had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than its original social functions could safely accommodate. What it revealed about the system was that the same competitive, honor-based values that had made Viking society successful in smaller, simpler contexts could become actively destructive when applied to the larger, more complex political situations of the later Viking Age. The deeper meaning of Harald's feast disaster was that it demonstrated the fundamental tension between traditional Viking social customs and the realities of operating in an increasingly interconnected and politically sophisticated medieval world. The feast protocols that had originally developed to manage relationships within relatively small, culturally homogeneous communities were being applied to situations involving multiple kingdoms, competing religious systems, complex international alliances, and military campaigns that could affect the balance of power across Northern Europe. Long-term effects of this kind of feast culture breakdown included the gradual abandonment of traditional Viking social customs in favor of more formalized court protocols borrowed from other European cultures. Later Scandinavian rulers began adopting feast customs from Byzantine, Frankish, and English courts that emphasized ceremony and hierarchy over the competitive personal displays that had characterized traditional Viking gatherings. Why historians still debate these events is that they represent a crucial transition period in Scandinavian political development, when traditional Norse customs were coming into conflict with the requirements of operating medieval kingdoms. Some scholars argue that feast culture disasters like Harald's represent the inevitable breakdown of outdated social systems, while others contend that these events demonstrate the flexibility and adaptability of Viking culture, noting that the same competitive spirit that caused problems at feasts also drove Viking military and commercial success. The broader implications extend to our understanding of how traditional cultures adapt to changing circumstances, how social protocols evolve under pressure, and how the same cultural values that create success in one context can become liabilities in another. Harald's feast serves as a historical case study in organizational psychology, demonstrating how group dynamics can spiral out of control when traditional management techniques are applied to situations they weren't designed to handle, with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate social context. around the main events and dramatic political maneuvering of Viking feasts. A fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that were often more entertaining than the supposed. Main attractions. Bjorn the Cupbearer was a professional servant whose job description read like a combination of sommelier, bodyguard, and diplomatic intelligence agent. This guy wasn't just filling drinking horns. He was a master of reading social dynamics, who could prevent wars by strategically controlling alcohol distribution and timing his service to diffuse tense moments. Bjorn's legendary skills included the ability to dilute aggressive guest drinks without them noticing, serve stronger beverages to shy participants who needed liquid courage, and somehow always appear at exactly the right moment to refill a void cup just as someone was about to say something diplomatically catastrophic. Bjorn's significance went far beyond mere drink service. He maintained detailed mental records of every guest's drinking preferences, alcohol tolerance, and behavioral patterns while intoxicated, making him essentially a walking database of useful blackmail material and social intelligence. His story includes the famous incident where he prevented a war between Denmark and Norway by gradually switching two rival jarls to progressively weaker drinks throughout an evening, ensuring that their escalating insults remained at the level of harmless verbal sparring rather than crossing into actual fighting words. When morning came, both men remembered having brilliant conversations with each other and couldn't quite recall why they had been angry in the first place. Ragnhild the Skald represented a different aspect of feast culture, the professional entertainers, whose performances could make or break an evening's success. This woman wasn't just a storyteller. She was a combination of historian, comedian, and psychological warfare specialist who could compose and deliver poetry that would be remembered for generations. Ragnhild's specialty was creating elaborate praise poems that managed to compliment everyone present while subtly insulting people who weren't there, a skill that required encyclopedic knowledge of Scandinavian genealogies, political relationships, and historical grudges. Her different aspect was that she operated as an independent contractor who served multiple patrons, meaning she had to maintain careful neutrality while seeming to favor whoever was currently paying her. Ragnhild's story includes the remarkable feat of performing at 3 different feasts in the same week that were hosted by rival factions, delivering completely different versions of the same historical events that made each audience feel like the heroes of the story. Her ability to tailor her material to different political perspectives while maintaining artistic integrity made her one of the most valuable and trusted entertainers in medieval Scandinavia. Grim the Gift-Bearer showed another angle of feast culture, the professional diplomats who specialized in navigating the complex protocols surrounding present exchanges. This character wasn't a wealthy noble giving generous gifts from his own resources. He was a middle-class entrepreneur who had built a business around understanding the intricate social mathematics of Viking gift-giving. Grim maintained detailed records of every gift exchanged at major feasts, tracking the evolving relationships between different participants and advising clients on appropriate, present choices that would achieve their political and social objectives. His contribution to the narrative was demonstrating how Viking feast culture had become sophisticated, enough to support entire service industries dedicated to managing its complexities. Grim's business model involved maintaining relationships with craftsmen, traders, and suppliers across Northern Europe, allowing him to acquire appropriate gifts for any social situation. His services included not just procurement but also timing, advice, knowing when to give gifts, how to present them, and what messages different choices would send to various audiences. One of his most famous achievements was helping a minor Norwegian chieftain navigate a Danish royal feast by providing a sequence of carefully chosen gifts that elevated the chieftain's status from insignificant foreigner to honored ally. Over the course of a single evening, these supporting characters weren't just colorful. Background figures. They were essential infrastructure that made the elaborate social performances of a Viking feast culture possible. Without professionals like Bjorn managing the alcohol dynamics, Ragnhild providing entertainment that supported rather than undermined the host's objectives, and Grim ensuring that gift exchanges reinforced rather than disrupted social relationships. The complex political negotiations that took place at these gatherings would have been impossible to manage successfully. These weren't isolated incidents featuring independent operators working separately. The relationships and collaborations between feast professionals created intricate networks that spanned kingdoms and influenced major political developments across medieval Scandinavia. How Stories Connect reveals a web of relationships that operated like an early version of a professional services industry, with specialists coordinating their efforts to create seamless feast experiences that served their patrons' broader political objectives. The webs of relationships between feast professionals were particularly evident during the legendary Roskilde Treaty Feast of 1027, where representatives from Denmark, Norway, and England gathered to negotiate territorial agreements. Following a series of Viking raids, this wasn't just a diplomatic dinner. It was a carefully orchestrated performance that required coordination between dozens of specialists, working behind the scenes to ensure that every aspect of the evening supported the delicate negotiations. Bjorn, the cupbearer, collaborated closely with Ragnhild the Skald to create what was essentially a choreographed experience where entertainment and alcohol service worked together to guide the emotional trajectory of the evening. They had developed a sophisticated signaling system where Ragnhild's poetry choices would indicate to Bjorn which guests needed stronger drinks to boost their confidence, which ones needed to be sobered up before they said something stupid, and when the overall mood needed to be shifted from serious negotiation to celebratory conclusion. Political and social networks extended beyond individual feast events to create lasting professional relationships that influenced how medieval Scandinavian diplomacy actually functioned. Grim the gift-bearer worked closely with both entertainers and service staff to coordinate gift presentations with entertainment segments and alcohol service, ensuring that valuable presents were given when recipients were in the right mood to appreciate them and witnesses were sober enough to remember the gestures later. How one event led to another became clear through the professional networks that developed around feast culture. Success at one major gathering would lead to recommendations and referrals that could establish a specialist reputation across multiple kingdoms. Ragnhild's performance at the Roskilde feast was so diplomatically effective that she received invitations to work similar events in Sweden, Iceland, and even Norman France, essentially becoming a traveling diplomatic consultant whose services were valued by rulers who needed to navigate complex international negotiations. The unintended consequences of these professional networks included the development of standardized feast protocols that began to replace traditional local customs. As the same specialists worked events across different regions, they gradually introduced commodic practices that made it easier for guests from different cultures to participate comfortably in each other's social events. This cultural homogenization had both positive and negative effects. It reduced the potential for diplomatic misunderstandings, but it also eroded some of the distinctive regional traditions that had given different Viking communities their unique identities. One particularly fascinating connection involved the collaboration between Grim and a network of craftsmen who began creating specialized feast items designed to serve specific diplomatic functions. These included drinking horns with hidden compartments for storing small gifts, ceremonial weapons that could be presented as symbolic gestures without actually arming potential enemies, and decorative items that incorporated symbols from multiple cultural traditions to appeal to diverse audiences. The professional relationships that developed around feast culture also created opportunities for intelligence gathering and information sharing that had implications far beyond individual social events. Specialists who worked multiple courts naturally accumulated information about different rulers' plans, resources, and relationships, making them valuable sources of intelligence for anyone willing to pay for such information. Some feast professionals essentially operated as informal diplomatic intelligence services, providing their patrons with insights into rival kingdoms, intentions, and capabilities that could influence everything from trade negotiations to military planning. The connections between different feast events also created opportunities for long-term relationship building that went far beyond the immediate diplomatic objectives of individual gatherings. Young nobles who met at feasts often maintained friendships and alliances that would influence their later careers, while the professional feast specialists who facilitated these connections became trusted advisors, whose influence extended into areas like marriage negotiations, business partnerships, and military alliances. To understand the significance of these feast professionals and their interconnected operations, you have to understand the broader cultural context in which they operated, a world where personal relationships were the primary mechanism for conducting business, resolving disputes, and maintaining social order. Daily life in Viking Age Scandinavia didn't include the formal institutions that modern societies rely on for managing complex social and economic relationships. There were no corporations, government bureaucracies, professional associations, or standardized legal systems that could handle the kinds of sophisticated negotiations that took place at major feasts. Instead, everything depended on personal trust, reputation, and the ability to navigate complex networks of mutual obligation and reciprocal favor trading. This meant that social events like feasts weren't just entertainment, they were essential infrastructure for maintaining the relationships that made civilization possible. The beliefs and attitudes that shaped this culture emphasized honor, loyalty, and personal reputation as the most valuable assets anyone could possess, creating a social environment where skilled relationship managers, like feast professionals, became incredibly valuable. The social structures that supported feast culture were based on the assumption that personal relationships were more reliable than formal agreements, that face-to-face interaction was necessary for establishing trust, and that shared experiences like meals and entertainment created bonds that could survive political disagreements and economic conflicts. These assumptions shaped how Viking society organized everything from trade relationships to military alliances, making feast culture central to their entire economic and political system. What was normal versus exceptional in this context reveals how sophisticated Viking social culture had become by the height of the feast period. Normal feast events included elaborate gift exchanges, competitive entertainment, and carefully managed social interactions that followed established protocols, while exceptional events like Harald's disastrous pre-invasion feast were remembered, precisely because they violated expected norms and created memorable dramatic incidents. The role of specialized feast professionals was normal and expected at any major social gathering, while their absence would have been exceptional and potentially embarrassing for hosts who wanted to be taken seriously by their peers. The level of coordination and planning that went into major feasts was normal for important political events, while spontaneous or poorly organized gatherings were exceptional and often interpreted as signs of disrespect or incompetence. How this cultural context shaped events was that it created an environment where social skills were as important as military prowess or economic resources for achieving political success. Leaders who could host successful feasts, navigate complex social situations, and maintain extensive networks of personal relationships had significant advantages over those who relied solely on force or wealth to achieve their objectives. The cultural emphasis on personal honor and reputation also meant that feast culture had genuine consequences for participants' long-term prospects. making it a serious business rather than mere entertainment. This seriousness created the market for professional feast services, as the stakes involved were high enough to justify investing in specialist expertise to ensure successful outcomes. Perhaps most amusing was the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Viking feast culture. A society famous for its warriors and raiders had developed social customs so complex and refined that they required professional consultants to navigate successfully. The same people who could pillage monasteries and conquer kingdoms apparently needed expert guidance to get through dinner parties without accidentally starting wars or destroying their reputations through social blunders. Examples of contradictions included the fact that Viking culture celebrated both spontaneous courage and careful planning, leading to feast situations where guests were expected to appear boldly spontaneous, while actually following elaborate scripts and protocols. The most successful feast participants were those who could make calculated political moves look like natural expressions of their personalities, while the most disastrous incidents often involved people who tried to be genuinely spontaneous in situations that required careful coordination. Another irony was that a culture that prized individual achievement and personal glory had created social institutions that required extensive collaboration and team effort to function successfully. The great feast performances that made individual nobles famous were actually the products of coordinated efforts involving dozens of specialists working behind the scenes. But the cultural narrative focused on individual hosts and guests rather than acknowledging the professional infrastructure that made their success possible. How things weren't what they seemed extended to the apparent informality of feast culture, which masked highly formalized systems of social control and relationship management. What looked like casual social interaction was actually carefully managed political theater, while what appeared to be spontaneous entertainment was often scripted performance designed to achieve specific diplomatic objectives. Modern parallels to these contradictions include the way contemporary business networking events combine apparently casual social interaction with serious professional objectives, or how modern celebrity culture requires extensive professional support systems, while maintaining the illusion of natural charisma and effortless success. The Viking feast professionals were essentially running early versions of what we might recognize today as event planning, public relations, and diplomatic consulting services, but their work was disguised as traditional hospitality rather than acknowledged as professional expertise. A contradiction between Viking reputation for straightforward warrior culture and the reality of their sophisticated social institutions reveals how historical stereotypes often obscure the complexity of past societies. While the gap between feast culture's appearance and reality demonstrates how social institutions often function through maintaining useful fictions about their own nature and purposes, everything changed when King Magnus the Good of Norway decided in 1035 that traditional Viking feast culture was getting completely out of hand and needed to be civilized according to European Christian standards. This wasn't just a religious conversion story, it was a calculated political decision by a ruler who had watched too many of his predecessors destroy themselves through feast-related diplomatic disasters and concluded that the old ways were becoming a liability in an increasingly interconnected medieval world. The background to this change was Magnus's realization that while Viking feast culture impressed other Scandinavians, it horrified potential Christian allies who viewed the competitive drinking, poetry duels, and casual violence as evidence of barbarism that made diplomatic relationships with more civilized kingdoms nearly impossible. Why this moment was different from previous attempts at feast reform was that Magnus had both the political authority and the practical experience necessary to implement systematic changes. Unlike earlier rulers who had tried to modify feast customs while maintaining their essential character, Magnus was willing to completely replace traditional protocols with new systems. borrowed from Byzantine and Frankish court culture. His approach wasn't gradual evolution. It was revolutionary, transformation disguised as religious improvement. The key factors that led to this transformation included Magnus's exposure to foreign court cultures during his exile in Kiev, where he had witnessed firsthand how more formalized feast protocols could serve diplomatic functions without the constant risk of violent escalation that characterized traditional Viking gatherings. He had also seen how Christian feast customs could be used to reinforce royal authority and social hierarchy in ways that traditional competitive Viking feasts actually undermined, since they gave too many opportunities for ambitious guests to challenge their host status through public displays of wit, courage, or generosity. Magnus's decision was also influenced by practical economic considerations. Traditional Viking feasts had become so expensive and complex that they were bankrupting even wealthy nobles, while the constant political crises they generated were disrupting trade relationships and military alliances that Norway needed to maintain its position in the changing medieval political landscape. The competitive escalation that had made Viking feast culture exciting had also made it economically unsustainable and diplomatically dangerous. But perhaps most importantly, Magnus recognized that traditional feast culture was actually working against the goal of centralizing royal authority. The old system gave too much power to individual nobles, who could use their feast-hosting skills to build independent power bases and challenge royal authority. A more formalized court system would concentrate social influence in the royal court, while reducing the ability of rival nobles to use feast culture as a platform for political ambition. The timing was also crucial. Magnus was implementing these changes during a period when Scandinavian society was undergoing broader transformations towards centralized monarchy, Christianity, and integration with European political systems. Traditional Viking feast culture had developed during an earlier period of smaller, more autonomous communities, and it was increasingly poorly suited to the requirements of governing larger, more complex kingdoms that needed to maintain relationships with Christian European powers. Magnus's announcement that he was reforming feast customs to honor God and promote civilization was actually a declaration of war against the entire traditional power structure of Viking society, though it was diplomatically packaged as religious improvement rather than political revolution. How the change unfolded was both more gradual and more dramatic than Magnus initially planned, as he discovered that replacing deeply ingrained cultural traditions required constant vigilance, creative problem-solving, and occasional strategic compromises that sometimes undermined his original reform objectives. The resistance to change came from predictable sources: traditional nobles, who had built their reputations and power bases through the old feast culture, professional entertainers and service providers whose livelihoods depended on traditional protocols, and younger warriors who viewed the reforms as attacks on their cultural identity and opportunities for advancement. But Magnus also encountered unexpected resistance from sources he had assumed would support his changes. Some Christian clergy opposed his reforms because they were too obviously political rather than genuinely religious, while certain foreign diplomats actually preferred the predictability of traditional Viking feast customs to Magnus's hybrid system that combined elements from different court cultures in ways that could be confusing for outsiders. Even some of Magnus's own supporters worried that the changes were happening too quickly and might destabilize the social relationships that held the kingdom together. The champions of change included a surprising coalition of merchants who wanted more predictable social protocols for conducting business, minor nobles who saw opportunities to advance in a more formalized court system, and pragmatic warriors who recognized that adapting to European standards would create better opportunities for military service in foreign armies. Magnus also found allies among some of the professional feast specialists, who were able to adapt their skills to the new protocols and actually found the reform system more profitable than the traditional chaos. The specific steps and stages of implementation revealed Magnus's sophisticated understanding of change management, though he probably wouldn't have recognized that modern terminology. He began by introducing changes gradually at smaller, less politically significant gatherings, allowing people to become familiar with new protocols before implementing them at major state occasions. The first major reform was replacing competitive poetry with formal ceremonial speeches that followed predetermined scripts, which reduced the risk of accidental insults while still allowing for impressive displays of learning and loyalty. The obstacles encountered were numerous and sometimes amusing. Many traditional feast participants simply didn't know how to behave according to the new protocols, leading to situations where elderly warriors sat in confused silence during formal ceremonies or attempted to start drinking contests during religious observances. The professional entertainers struggled to adapt their competitive performance styles to the more ceremonial requirements of the reformed system, while servants trained in traditional protocols had to learn entirely new systems for managing food service, gift presentation, and alcohol distribution. Breakthrough moments included the successful hosting of a major diplomatic feast for representatives from the Holy Roman Empire, where Magnus's reformed protocols impressed the foreign guests so much that they recommended Norway as a reliable ally to other Christian kingdoms. This success demonstrated that the changes were achieving their intended diplomatic objectives, providing Magnus with the political capital necessary to continue implementing reforms despite ongoing resistance from traditional elements. The role of individuals versus larger forces in driving change was complex and sometimes contradictory. While Magnus was clearly the primary driving force behind the reforms, their success depended on the cooperation of hundreds of individuals who had to learn new behaviors, adapt their professional skills, or simply accept that their traditional roles were changing. Some changes succeeded because they aligned with broader social trends toward centralization and Christianization, while others failed because they conflicted with deeply held cultural values that couldn't be easily modified through royal decree. One particularly significant breakthrough came when Ragnhild the Skald, the legendary entertainment professional from earlier in our story, successfully adapted her skills to the new system by creating a hybrid performance style that combined traditional Norse storytelling with Christian moral instruction and formal court ceremony. Her success demonstrated that the changes didn't necessarily require abandoning all traditional elements, but rather finding ways to integrate them with new requirements. The most challenging obstacle was managing the transition period when both old and new protocols were operating simultaneously, creating confusion about which rules applied in different situations. Magnus had to develop complex guidelines for determining when traditional customs were still appropriate versus when reform protocols were required. And these distinctions often depended on subtle factors like the political status of participants, the specific purpose of the gathering, and the potential diplomatic implications of different behavior choices. Eventually, Magnus established a formal court position, the Master of Ceremonies, whose job was specifically to manage these protocol decisions and ensure consistent application of the new standards. This innovation was actually borrowed from Byzantine court culture, but it proved so successful that it was eventually adopted by other Scandinavian kingdoms and became a standard feature of medieval European court systems. The new feast system that emerged from Magnus's reforms was fundamentally different from traditional Viking culture in ways that affected every aspect of how these social gatherings functioned. How things were different became apparent immediately. Instead of competitive displays of individual prowess, the reformed feasts emphasized collective participation in ceremonial activities that reinforced social hierarchy rather than challenging it. The spontaneous poetry duels that had made traditional feasts exciting but dangerous were replaced by carefully scripted entertainments that provided spectacle without political risk. Who won and who lost in this transformation created lasting changes in Scandinavian social structure. The clear winners were the royal court and its associated bureaucracy, which gained much greater control over social and political relationships that had previously operated through independent networks of personal obligation. Merchants and craftsmen also benefited from more predictable social protocols that made business relationships easier to establish and maintain. Some traditional entertainers and service professionals successfully adapted to the new system and found steady employment in the expanding court bureaucracy. The losers included the traditional warrior aristocracy, whose power had depended on their ability to host impressive feasts and build independent political networks through competitive social display. Many of the old-style feast professionals found their skills obsolete and their services no longer in demand. Younger nobles who had been expecting to advance through traditional competitive feast culture discovered that success now required different skills: formal education, court etiquette, and administrative competence rather than wit, courage, and drinking capacity. The new rules and norms were codified in what Magnus called the courtly conduct codes, which were essentially instruction manuals for participating in reformed feast culture. These documents specified everything from appropriate conversation topics and acceptable gift values to proper seating arrangements and ceremonial procedures. Unlike traditional feast culture, which had operated through informal customs that everyone was expected to learn through observation and experience, the reformed system relied on written rules that could be studied and enforced consistently. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the selective nature of Magnus's reforms. Some traditional elements, like the importance of hospitality, the centrality of gift-giving, and the use of feasts for diplomatic purposes, were preserved but modified to fit new protocols. The basic structure of feast events remained similar, but the competitive and potentially dangerous elements were removed or carefully controlled. Food preparation and service maintained high standards but became more standardized and less focused on impressive individual displays of culinary innovation. The most dramatic change was in the role of alcohol in feast culture. Traditional Viking feasts had used drinking as a way to test courage, build camaraderie, and break down social barriers that might inhibit honest communication. The reformed system treated alcohol as a ceremonial element that should enhance dignity rather than challenge self-control. This change alone eliminated many of the situations that had made traditional feasts unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Another significant transformation was in how entertainment functioned. Instead of competitive performances that allowed participants to challenge each other indirectly through wit and skill, the new system featured professional entertainers who performed for rather than with the audience. This change reduced opportunities for spontaneous political drama, but also eliminated many of the situations that had allowed ambitious individuals to use feast culture as a platform for advancing their personal agendas. The reformed feast culture also introduced new forms of social recognition that emphasized loyalty and service to the crown rather than individual achievement and competitive success. The new system created opportunities for advancement through administrative competence and court favor rather than through the dramatic personal displays that had characterized traditional Viking culture, fundamentally altering how ambitious individuals planned their careers and built their reputations. Was this change positive or negative? The question itself reveals the complexity of evaluating historical transformations that affected different groups in different ways and achieved some objectives while creating new problems. From Magnus's perspective, the reforms were undeniably successful they reduced the diplomatic crises and political chaos that had plagued traditional feast culture while establishing Norway as a more reliable partner for Christian European kingdoms. The reformed system achieved its primary objectives of centralizing royal authority and integrating Scandinavian society with broader European political networks. Different perspectives on the reforms reflect the varied experiences of different social groups during the transition. Traditional nobles, who lost power and influence, naturally viewed the changes as destructive attacks on their cultural heritage and legitimate political prerogatives. Merchants and minor administrators, who benefited from more predictable social protocols, saw the reforms as progressive improvements that created better opportunities for economic advancement and social mobility. Foreign diplomats generally praised the changes as evidence of Scandinavian civilization and political maturity. Short-term versus long-term effects present different evaluation criteria. In the immediate aftermath of the reforms, Norwegian society experienced increased political stability and improved international relationships, but also cultural confusion and social tension as people adapted to new expectations and protocols. Long-term effects included the successful integration of Scandinavian kingdoms into medieval European political systems, but also the gradual erosion of distinctive Norse cultural traditions that had given Viking society its unique character and competitive advantages. Unintended consequences of the reforms included the development of a more rigid social hierarchy that reduced opportunities for social mobility. The decline of the innovative feast professionals who had created much of the sophistication of traditional Viking culture, and the gradual loss of the improvisational social skills that had made Scandinavians effective diplomats and traders. In diverse cultural contexts, modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals how historical evaluation criteria change over time. Contemporary observers generally viewed Magnus's reforms as necessary adaptations to changing political circumstances, while modern historians debate whether the changes represented genuine progress or cultural loss. Some contemporary critics worried that the reforms were undermining essential elements of Scandinavian identity, while others celebrated them as overdue improvements that would allow Nordic societies to participate more effectively in European civilization. The most balanced evaluation recognizes that Magnus's feast reforms were successful responses to specific historical challenges that achieved their primary objectives while creating new problems and eliminating valuable cultural elements that couldn't be easily replaced once they were lost. In the years and decades that followed Magnus's feast reforms, how things developed revealed both the unexpected success and the unintended complications of trying to completely transform a culture's social institutions through royal decree. The immediate aftermath was a period of cultural confusion that lasted nearly a generation, as different segments of Scandinavian society adapted to the new protocols at different speeds and with varying degrees of enthusiasm. What emerged wasn't exactly what Magnus had planned. Instead of a neat transition from barbaric Viking customs to civilized European court culture, Scandinavian society developed a unique hybrid system that combined elements from multiple traditions in ways that sometimes worked brilliantly and sometimes created entirely new problems. New challenges arose almost immediately as other Scandinavian rulers tried to implement their own versions of Magnus's reforms, often with disastrous results that demonstrated how much the success of cultural change depends on specific local circumstances and skilled implementation. The King of Denmark attempted to copy Norway's reformed feast protocols, but made the mistake of trying to implement all the changes simultaneously rather than gradually, creating such chaos that several major diplomatic meetings had to be postponed when participants couldn't figure out what they were supposed to be doing. Meanwhile, Swedish nobles developed their own interpretation of reformed feast culture that maintained most of the competitive elements of traditional Viking customs, while adding elaborate Christian ceremonial components, creating a bizarre hybrid that confused foreign guests and sometimes resulted in religious ceremonies devolving into drinking contests. The Icelandic response was even more creative. They maintained traditional feast customs, but added formal written invitations and predetermined seating charts, essentially bureaucratizing Viking culture without actually changing its fundamental character. The evolution of the situation included the gradual development of regional variations that reflected different kingdoms' attempts to balance traditional customs with reform protocols. Norwegian court culture became increasingly formalized and ceremonial, emphasizing royal dignity and hierarchical order in ways that impressed foreign diplomats but sometimes left participants feeling like they were attending religious services rather than social gatherings. Danish feast culture evolved toward what modern observers might recognize as early diplomatic receptions, with elaborate protocol manuals governing every aspect of international entertaining. Second generation effects became apparent as the children of the reformed generation grew up with the new systems and began modifying them based on their own experiences and preferences. These younger nobles had never experienced traditional Viking feast culture directly, so they viewed the reformed protocols as normal rather than as departures from tradition. This generational shift allowed for further innovations that older participants might have resisted as too radical, including the introduction of written menu cards, assigned seating arrangements, and even primitive forms of what we might recognize today as event programs that outlined the evening's planned activities. But perhaps most significantly, the feast reforms had created a new professional class of court administrators, whose job was specifically managing social protocols and diplomatic entertainment. These positions became stepping stones to higher administrative roles, creating career paths that hadn't existed under traditional Viking culture. The emergence of this bureaucratic layer had lasting effects on how Scandinavian governments operated, introducing administrative approaches to social and diplomatic relationships that would influence Nordic political culture for centuries. The success of Magnus's reforms also created pressure for additional changes in other areas of Scandinavian society, as the contrast between reformed feast culture and traditional customs in other contexts became increasingly apparent and sometimes awkward. The transformed feast culture attracted and created entirely new categories of participants whose roles differed dramatically from the traditional Viking social structure. Archbishop Adalbert of Hamburg-Bremen emerged as one of the most influential figures in this new landscape, not because of his religious authority but because of his sophisticated understanding of how Christian ceremonial traditions could be adapted to serve the diplomatic functions previously handled by competitive Viking customs. This guy wasn't just performing religious duties, he was essentially serving as an international consultant on court protocol, helping Scandinavian rulers develop feast customs that would be impressive to other European Christians, while still maintaining enough Nordic character to satisfy local expectations. Adalbert's role represented something entirely new in Scandinavian culture, a religious figure whose influence extended into secular social and political affairs through his expertise in ceremonial protocol rather than through traditional sources of clerical power. His contributions included developing hybrid ceremonies that combined Christian blessing rituals with traditional gift-giving customs, creating formal prayer sequences that could replace competitive poetry without eliminating opportunities for impressive verbal displays, and establishing precedents for how religious and secular authority could collaborate in managing feast culture. Count Eric of Orkney represented a different type of new player, the professional diplomatic entertainer whose job was hosting feast events that served multiple kingdoms' interests simultaneously. Eric had inherited traditional Norse titles, but it built his career around his ability to organize gatherings that satisfied competing political factions without creating the conflicts that had plagued traditional feast culture. His innovation was developing what were essentially neutral venues where rival kingdoms could conduct diplomatic business through social interaction rather than formal negotiation. Eric's contributions to the evolving feast landscape included pioneering the concept of diplomatic immunity for feast guests, establishing protocols that allowed traditional enemies to attend the same social events without violating honor codes that would normally require them to fight each other. His specific stories include the famous Orkney Accords feast, where he successfully hosted representatives from Norway, Denmark, Scotland, and England simultaneously, managing the complex logistics of ensuring that no one felt slighted while preventing any of the traditional competitive behaviors that might have triggered international incidents. Master Wilhelm, the protocol keeper, represented the emergence of professional court administrators whose specialized knowledge of feast customs made them indispensable to rulers attempting to navigate the increasingly complex social requirements of medieval diplomacy. Wilhelm wasn't a noble or a cleric. He was essentially a middle-class professional whose expertise in etiquette, precedence, and ceremonial procedure gave him influence that rivaled traditional aristocrats. His role illustrates how the reformed feast culture had become sophisticated, enough to require specialized expertise that couldn't be learned through traditional apprenticeship or inherited through family connections. Wilhelm's contributions included creating the first systematic written guides to Scandinavian court protocol, establishing training programs for court staff who needed to understand the complex requirements of diplomatic entertaining, and developing standardized procedures that could be applied consistently across different types of feast events. His innovations made it possible for smaller kingdoms to host successful diplomatic gatherings without requiring the extensive traditional knowledge that had previously limited effective feast hosting to establish noble families with generations of experience. How these new players differed from earlier feast culture participants was that their authority came from professional expertise, rather than traditional sources of power like military prowess, inherited status, or personal charisma. They represented the emergence of a more bureaucratic approach to social and diplomatic relationships that emphasized technical competence and systematic knowledge over the improvisational skills that had characterized traditional Viking culture. Their specific stories reveal how the reformed feast culture had created entirely new career paths and forms of social influence that allowed people from non-traditional backgrounds to achieve positions of importance in Scandinavian society. This expansion of opportunity was one of the most significant long-term effects of Magnus's reforms, though it also contributed to the gradual erosion of traditional Viking social structures. But some problems persisted despite the elaborate reforms, and the emergence of professional feast management, revealing that certain challenges were inherent in using social gatherings for diplomatic purposes, regardless of the specific cultural protocols involved. Continuing challenges included the fundamental tension between the hospitality requirements of effective entertaining and the security concerns raised by bringing together people who might have good reasons to assassinate each other. The reformed protocols had reduced the risk of spontaneous violence during feast events, but they hadn't eliminated the underlying political conflicts that made such gatherings potentially dangerous. What didn't get resolved through Magnus's reforms was the basic problem of how to balance authentic social interaction with the artificial constraints required for diplomatic safety. The new protocols were successful at preventing the kind of chaotic escalation that had characterized traditional Viking feasts, but they often created atmospheres so formal and controlled that genuine relationship building became difficult or impossible. Participants complained that the reformed feasts felt more like theatrical performances than actual social events. reducing their effectiveness for the trust building that was supposed to be their primary diplomatic function. New versions of old problems emerged as ambitious individuals found ways to exploit the reform protocols for personal advancement in much the same way that previous generations had used traditional competitive feast culture. The difference was that instead of challenging rivals through poetry duels or drinking contests, the new system rewarded those who could master ceremonial procedures, manipulate seating arrangements, or exploit gift-giving protocols to send subtle political messages. The reform system hadn't eliminated political competition. It had just changed the rules of engagement. Cyclical patterns became apparent as the same. Basic social dynamics that had caused problems in traditional feast culture reasserted themselves. Within the new ceremonial framework, despite all the careful protocol development and professional management, feast events continued to be disrupted by personal rivalries, cultural misunderstandings, and the inherent unpredictability of mixing alcohol, politics, and human ego in social settings. The specific manifestations were different, but the underlying patterns remained remarkably consistent. Why certain issues proved intractable was that they stemmed from fundamental aspects of human nature and political necessity that couldn't be eliminated through protocol reform. The competitive instincts that had made traditional Viking culture dynamic and innovative didn't disappear when formal rules were imposed. They just found new outlets that were sometimes more subtle, but equally disruptive. The need for leaders to demonstrate strength and build personal loyalty remained as important as ever. But the reform protocols made it harder to achieve these objectives through direct action. One particularly persistent problem was the authenticity gap between what feast culture was supposed to accomplish and what it actually achieved under the new protocols. Traditional Viking feasts had been genuine social interactions that built real relationships, even when they occasionally exploded into violence. The reformed system was safer and more predictable, but often felt artificial and performed in ways that actually hindered the relationship building that was supposed to be its primary purpose. The most frustrating ongoing issue was that the reformed feast culture required constant professional management and careful preparation that made it expensive and logistically complicated. But the results were often less memorable and politically effective than the chaotic traditional gatherings it had replaced. Participants frequently complained that they learned more about potential allies and enemies during a single traditional feast disaster than they could glean from years of perfectly executed ceremonial events. Regional variations in how different kingdoms implemented the reforms created additional complications, as diplomats and court officials had to master multiple sets of protocols depending on where they were attending events. What was considered proper etiquette in Norwegian court culture might be insulting in Danish contexts, while Swedish feast customs could confuse participants who were expecting more standardized European protocols compared to the earlier period of traditional Viking feast culture. The reformed system represented both genuine improvements and significant losses that reveal the complex trade-offs involved in any major cultural transformation. What was unique about the Scandinavian experience was how quickly and systematically an entire culture had attempted to replace traditional social institutions with imported alternatives, creating a historical case study in managed cultural change that had few parallels in medieval Europe. Compared to other places and time periods, the Scandinavian feast reforms were remarkably successful in achieving their stated objectives of reducing violence and improving diplomatic relationships, but they were also more culturally disruptive than similar changes in societies that had evolved more gradually toward formalized court cultures. The Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian courts had developed their elaborate protocols over centuries, allowing for gradual adaptation that preserved continuity with earlier traditions. The Scandinavian approach of rapid, systematic replacement created more immediate results but also more cultural discontinuity and social tension. What was universal about the Scandinavian experience was the way that social protocols inevitably reflect broader political and economic structures, meaning that changes in feast culture both responded to and reinforced other transformations happening in Scandinavian society. The shift toward more centralized monarchy, the adoption of Christianity, and the integration with European trade networks all contributed to making traditional Viking feast culture seem outdated and potentially counterproductive. Lessons that could be learned from the Scandinavian feast reforms include the importance of gradual implementation when attempting major cultural changes, the need to provide alternative outlets for the social functions served by traditional institutions, and the difficulty of maintaining authentic relationships within artificially constrained social frameworks. The Scandinavian experience also demonstrated how professional expertise can become a substitute for traditional cultural knowledge, but often at the cost of spontaneity and genuine social interaction, patterns that repeated elsewhere in medieval Europe included the tendency for court cultures to become increasingly elaborate and formal over time. The emergence of professional administrative classes whose authority derived from technical expertise rather than traditional sources of power, and the ongoing tension between the diplomatic utility of social gatherings and their potential for creating political complications. The most significant comparative insight is that the Scandinavian feast reforms represented an early example of what modern sociologists might recognize as institutional modernization, the replacement of traditional, informal social mechanisms with formal, professional systems designed to achieve more predictable and controllable outcomes. This process created both opportunities and problems that would become familiar patterns in other contexts where traditional cultures encountered pressure to adopt more modern institutional forms. The Scandinavian experience also illustrated how cultural change often involves choosing between competing values, in this case, between the excitement and authenticity of traditional feast culture and safety and diplomatic effectiveness of reform protocols. The solutions that different kingdoms developed reflected their particular priorities and circumstances, but none managed to achieve all the benefits of both systems simultaneously, suggesting that such cultural transformations inevitably involve genuine trade-offs rather than simple improvements. By the late 12th century, signs pointed to the inevitable obsolescence of the elaborate feast culture that had dominated Scandinavian diplomacy and social organization for over 2 centuries. Warning signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them, the most telling being that young nobles increasingly viewed feast hosting as an expensive burden rather than an exciting opportunity for political advancement. The generation that came of age during the 1180s had grown up with professional court administrators managing their social lives, and they frankly found the whole business of elaborate entertaining to be tedious bureaucratic theater rather than genuine political engagement. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complex dynamics of cultural change in societies undergoing fundamental political transformation. Experienced court administrators like Master Wilhelm's successors recognized that their elaborate protocol systems were becoming increasingly irrelevant as Scandinavian kingdoms developed more formal governmental institutions that handled diplomatic and administrative functions previously managed through feast culture. These professionals began quietly diversifying their skills, learning Latin literacy and administrative law rather than focusing exclusively on ceremonial expertise. But what they missed was how quickly the economic foundations of feast culture were eroding. The expensive ingredients, elaborate entertainments, and professional services that had made reformed feast culture impressive were becoming prohibitively costly, just as other demands on royal resources were increasing dramatically. The construction of stone churches, the maintenance of professional armies, and the development of administrative bureaucracies all required sustained financial commitments that made the intermittent but enormous expenses of feast culture seem like frivolous luxury rather than political necessity. Resistance to inevitable change came from predictable sources, but often took unexpected forms. Traditional entertainers and service professionals who had built their careers around feast culture didn't just quietly accept obsolescence. They began actively sabotaging the newer institutional arrangements that were replacing their services. Some court scribes who had specialized in feast documentation began, accidentally, losing records of diplomatic agreements negotiated through formal governmental channels, while maintaining meticulous records of traditional feast negotiations, in an attempt to demonstrate the superior reliability of their traditional methods. More surprisingly, resistance also came from foreign diplomats who had become comfortable with Scandinavian feast protocols and were frustrated by having to learn new systems for conducting international business. The Archbishop of Canterbury reportedly complained to the Pope that Norwegian kings were becoming insufferably bureaucratic, and that it was much easier to negotiate with rulers who still conducted business through proper Christian hospitality, rather than through formal administrative procedures. The most significant warning sign was the emergence of what contemporary chroniclers called feast fatigue, a widespread cultural exhaustion with the complex social performances that had once been exciting displays of political skill and cultural sophistication. Participants increasingly described major feast events as obligations to be endured rather than opportunities to be seized, while hosts complained about the enormous effort required to organize gatherings that no longer achieved significant political objectives. Even the professional feast managers who had built the reformed system recognized that their elaborate protocols were becoming counterproductive. The very predictability and safety that had made the reformed feast culture diplomatically useful had also made it boring and politically irrelevant, while the cost and complexity of maintaining professional feast operations was beginning to exceed their practical value in an era when other diplomatic and administrative mechanisms were becoming more efficient and reliable. How the era of Allers, an era when other diplomatic and administrative mechanisms were becoming more efficient and reliable. How the era of Arsuras and reliable Viking feast culture ended wasn't through dramatic collapse or royal decree, but through a process of gradual irrelevance that made these once essential social institutions seem quaint and old-fashioned rather than politically important. The specific events that marked the transition were so undramatic that contemporary observers barely noticed them. The last truly significant diplomatic feast in Scandinavian history was probably King Canute VI of Denmark's reception for Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in 1184. And even that event was remembered more for its administrative efficiency than for any dramatic social dynamics or memorable political outcomes. Final major players in the feast culture drama included professional administrators who had spent their careers managing these elaborate social systems, but were now transitioning to more conventional governmental roles. Master Harald, the protocol keeper, the last of the great feast specialists, reportedly spent his final years writing administrative manuals for tax collection and legal procedure rather than ceremonial guidelines, symbolically representing the shift from social to bureaucratic approaches to governmental administration. The last attempts to preserve or revive traditional feast culture were often more pathetic than dramatic. Some minor nobles continued hosting elaborate gatherings well into the 13th century, but these events were increasingly seen as nostalgic historical reenactments rather than serious political activities. King Erik Plovening of Denmark attempted to revive feast diplomacy during the 1240s, hosting a series of elaborate gatherings that were intended to demonstrate Danish cultural sophistication, but instead highlighted how outdated these approaches had become compared to the formal treaty negotiations and bureaucratic procedures that had replaced them. More successful were the gradual transformations that preserved some elements of feast culture within new institutional frameworks. Royal courts maintained ceremonial dining traditions that honored the hospitality customs of their ancestors, while serving primarily symbolic rather than political functions. The Swedish court developed what were essentially museum piece recreations of traditional feast protocols that could be performed for foreign visitors who wanted to experience authentic Scandinavian culture. But these were clearly tourist attractions rather than functioning political institutions. The dramatic final moments of feast culture as a serious political force occurred not during any single spectacular event, but through a series of small incidents that revealed how thoroughly the underlying assumptions had changed. When the Norwegian court attempted to negotiate a trade agreement with German merchants through traditional feast hospitality in 1203, the merchants politely endured the ceremonial elements but insisted on conducting actual business through written contracts and formal legal procedures that completely bypassed the social relationship building that had been the entire point of the feast approach. Perhaps most symbolically, the last recorded instance of traditional competitive feast behavior occurred in 1211, when an elderly Icelandic skald attempted to challenge a visiting English diplomat to a poetry duel during a formal court dinner. Instead of responding with his own verse composition, the English representative simply thanked his host for the quaint local entertainment and continued his conversation about grain import regulations. The skald's cultural performance, which would have been politically significant a century earlier, was now merely exotic curiosity that had no impact on the serious business of international relations. The gradual decline was also marked by the physical transformation of the spaces where feasts had been held. The great halls that had been designed for traditional feast culture were being subdivided into administrative offices, while new royal residences were constructed with smaller, more private dining spaces that reflected the changing nature of political entertaining. Instead of the massive communal spaces that had accommodated hundreds of guests for competitive social displays, royal architecture began emphasizing privacy, comfort, and administrative efficiency over dramatic social theater. Even the professional feast culture industries that had developed during the Reform period found themselves adapting to new markets. The skilled cooks who had specialized in elaborate, ceremonial meals began working for wealthy merchant families who wanted impressive private dining experiences, while the protocol specialists transitioned to managing religious ceremonies or administrative procedures that required similar organizational skills, but served very different social functions. The symbolic endpoint of the feast culture era was probably the conversion of the Great Hall at Uppsala, once the most important feast venue in Sweden, into a record storage facility for the royal chancery sometime during the 1220s. The space that had once hosted competitive poetry duels and diplomatic drinking contests was now filled with administrative documents and filing systems, representing the complete triumph of bureaucratic over social approaches to governance. Analysis of causes reveals that Viking feast culture died not from external attack or internal corruption, but from evolutionary obsolescence as Scandinavian societies developed more efficient mechanisms for achieving the political, diplomatic, and social functions that feasts had originally served. Internal problems included the escalating costs and complexity of maintaining feast culture in increasingly sophisticated political environments, the growing mismatch between feast protocols and the actual requirements of medieval governmental administration, and the simple fact that the social skills and cultural knowledge required for effective feast participation were becoming less relevant to political success than literacy, legal training, and administrative competence. External pressures came primarily from the need to integrate with European political systems that operated through formal diplomatic protocols. written treaties, and bureaucratic procedures, rather than through personal relationships and social interaction. Scandinavian kingdoms that wanted to participate effectively in crusades, trade relationships with German merchants, or diplomatic negotiations with the papal court found that their traditional feast-based approaches to relationship building were often counterproductive or simply irrelevant to partners who expected more formal institutional arrangements. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending feast culture illustrates how personal choices and broader social trends interact in complex ways during periods of cultural transformation. Individual rulers, like the later Danish kings, made conscious decisions to abandon feast diplomacy in favor of more conventional European approaches. But these choices were responding to historical forces that made traditional methods increasingly impractical, regardless of personal preferences. What could have been done differently to preserve feast culture is an interesting counterfactual question that reveals the fundamental tensions between traditional and modern approaches to political organization. Feast culture might have survived longer if Scandinavian societies had remained smaller, more isolated, and less economically complex, but preserving traditional social institutions would have required rejecting the political and economic opportunities that came with European integration. The choice wasn't really between traditional and modern feast culture, but between maintaining distinctive Scandinavian traditions and participating effectively in medieval European civilization. Some contemporary observers suggested that feast culture could have been preserved through more selective adaptation rather than complete abandonment, maintaining traditional social elements for internal Scandinavian relationships, while using formal diplomatic procedures for international affairs. This hybrid approach was actually attempted by some rulers, but it proved too confusing and expensive to maintain two completely different systems of political relationship management simultaneously. The question of inevitability versus contingency in the decline of feast culture reflects broader historical debates about whether cultural changes are determined by material circumstances or influenced by conscious human choices. The evidence suggests that while the specific timing and manner of feast culture's decline involved individual decisions and particular circumstances, the general trend toward more formal, bureaucratic approaches to governance was probably inevitable, given the political and economic pressures that Scandinavian societies faced during this period. The most significant factor in feast culture's demise was probably the generational change that occurred as political leadership passed to individuals who had been educated in European court traditions rather than traditional Scandinavian customs. These younger rulers often viewed feast culture as an obstacle to political effectiveness rather than as an essential element of political legitimacy, making them more willing to abandon traditional approaches in favor of methods that seemed more practical and modern. The irony is that feast culture's decline accelerated precisely because the reforms of the previous century had been so successful at making Scandinavian feast traditions compatible with European standards. Once Scandinavian rulers had demonstrated their ability to operate according to European diplomatic norms, they discovered that maintaining their distinctive traditional approaches was no longer necessary for political acceptance and had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The immediate aftermath of feast culture's decline was characterized by a period of cultural uncertainty as Scandinavian societies struggled to replace the social and political functions that these elaborate gatherings had served for centuries. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the disappearance of feast culture included a variety of institutional innovations and professional specializations that attempted to achieve the relationship building, information sharing, and political coordination that had previously happened through social entertaining. The most successful replacement institutions were the formal royal councils that had been developing alongside feast culture but now became the primary mechanisms for political consultation and decision-making. These councils combine some of the consultative functions of traditional feast gatherings with the administrative efficiency and documentary precision that medieval governance increasingly required. Unlike feast culture, which had operated through personal relationships and informal agreements, the council system relied on written records, formal procedures, and institutional memory that could survive changes in personnel and political circumstances. Short-term consequences included a noticeable decline in the personal relationships between rulers and nobles that have been maintained through regular feast interaction, replaced by more formal, hierarchical relationships that emphasized institutional roles rather than personal bonds. Many contemporary observers noted that political relationships became more predictable and efficient, but also more distant and impersonal, reducing the kind of spontaneous cooperation and creative problem-solving that had sometimes emerged from traditional feast cultures. Unpredictable social dynamics taught contemporary reactions to the end of feast culture were mixed and often reflected generational and class divisions within Scandinavian society. Older nobles and traditional cultural conservatives mourned the loss of what they viewed as essential elements of their heritage, while younger administrators and internationally oriented political leaders celebrated the adoption of more modern and civilized approaches to governance that would make Scandinavian kingdoms more respectable partners in European affairs. Attempts at revival or continuation were numerous, but generally unsuccessful, revealing how thoroughly the political and economic foundations of feast culture had been transformed. Some wealthy families continued hosting elaborate, private dinners that maintained ceremonial elements of traditional feast culture, but these events served primarily social rather than political functions and had little influence on actual governmental affairs. Religious institutions occasionally organized ceremonial feasts that honored traditional customs while serving Christian rather than political purposes, but these adaptations preserved only superficial elements of the original tradition. The most interesting attempts at continuation involved the development of what might be called feast culture tourism, where foreign visitors and delegations were entertained according to traditional protocols as a way of demonstrating Scandinavian cultural sophistication while conducting actual business through conventional diplomatic channels. These performances served important symbolic functions in maintaining cultural identity and international prestige, but they were clearly theatrical rather than functional applications of traditional customs. Perhaps most significantly, the immediate legacy period saw the rapid development of historical literature that romanticized and mythologized feast culture, even as it was disappearing from practical political life. The saga literature that preserved many of our most detailed accounts of traditional Viking feast culture was largely composed during this transition period, suggesting that the end of living feast traditions created both the need and the opportunity for literary preservation of cultural memory. The legacy of Viking feast culture shaped later developments in ways that were often invisible to the people implementing changes, but which fundamentally influenced how Northern European societies approached everything from diplomatic protocol to business entertaining for centuries afterward. Specific influences can be traced through the development of Scandinavian court traditions that preserved modified versions of feast hospitality customs well into the early modern period, though few participants understood that their elaborate ceremonial dinners were evolutionary descendants of competitive Viking drinking contests and poetry duels. How later generations viewed Viking feast culture reveals the complex process by which historical memory transforms lived experience into a cultural mythology. By the 13th century, saga writers were already romanticizing feast traditions as examples of heroic authenticity and cultural sophistication that had been lost to modern, bureaucratic efficiency. These literary accounts emphasized the dramatic and entertaining aspects of feast culture while downplaying the practical political functions and frequent disasters that had characterized the actual historical experience, the myths versus realities that developed around feast culture included persistent beliefs that Viking feasts were spontaneous celebrations of warrior culture, when the historical evidence shows they were carefully planned political events that required extensive professional management and sophisticated logistical coordination. Popular imagination also romanticized the competitive aspects of feast culture while ignoring the elaborate safety protocols and diplomatic constraints that had been necessary to prevent these gatherings from devolving into actual warfare. Why feast culture remained important to historical memory was largely because it provided later generations with appealing narratives about authentic cultural identity and meaningful social connection that seemed to contrast favorably with their own more formal and impersonal institutional arrangements. The feast traditions became symbols of a supposedly simpler time when personal relationships and individual character mattered more than bureaucratic procedures and institutional authority. But the most significant historical impact was probably in the realm of diplomatic practice, where Viking feast innovations influenced the development of ceremonial protocols that became standard features of European court culture. The emphasis on gift exchange, ceremonial dining, and entertainment as elements of international diplomacy can be traced directly to Scandinavian feast traditions, though these practices were gradually formalized and institutionalized in ways that eliminated most of their original flexibility and spontaneity. The preserved influence extended into areas like trade negotiations, where the Scandinavian emphasis on personal relationship building through shared hospitality became integrated into Northern European commercial practices. The Hanseatic League, which dominated Baltic trade for centuries, operated according to protocols that combined formal commercial procedures with hospitality customs derived from earlier feast traditions, creating hybrid institutions that were more effective than either purely formal or purely traditional approaches. Perhaps most importantly, Viking feast culture contributed to the development of what modern historians recognize as personal diplomacy, the practice of conducting international relations through direct interaction between leaders, rather than exclusively through formal institutional channels. This approach influenced everything from medieval royal marriages to modern summit meetings, though the specific methods and cultural context have obviously changed dramatically. The legacy also appears in the persistent Scandinavian emphasis on egalitarian social interaction and consensus building that distinguishes Nordic political culture from more hierarchical European traditions. While modern Scandinavian democracy operates through very different mechanisms than medieval feast culture, both systems share assumptions about the importance of inclusive participation, open discussion, and collective decision-making that may reflect deep cultural continuities spanning more than a millennium. The influence on legal and governmental traditions was equally significant, though often overlooked by scholars who focus on more formal institutional developments. Many features of Scandinavian legal culture, including the emphasis on mediation, the preference for negotiated settlements over adversarial proceedings, and the tradition of community participation in legal decision-making, can be traced to practices that were originally developed and refined through feast culture's approach to managing social conflict and building consensus among competing factions. Today, we can see echoes of Viking feast culture in corporate entertainment, diplomatic summits, and social networking events that use hospitality and shared experiences to build relationships and conduct business in ways that would be immediately recognizable to a medieval Scandinavian feast coordinator. Specific parallels include the modern business dinner, where companies spend enormous amounts of money on elaborate meals designed to impress clients and build relationships that will supposedly translate into profitable business arrangements. Like Viking feasts, These events combine genuine hospitality with calculated political maneuvering, and their success often depends more on managing social dynamics than on the actual quality of the food or entertainment. The contemporary corporate retreat represents perhaps the closest modern parallel to Viking feast culture, combining elements of competition, team building, entertainment, and relationship development in settings designed to break down normal hierarchical barriers while still serving specific organizational objectives. Modern retreat facilitators essentially perform the same functions as medieval feast coordinators, managing group dynamics to achieve predetermined outcomes while maintaining the illusion that what's happening is spontaneous social interaction, rather than carefully orchestrated organizational development. Modern diplomatic summits reveal particularly striking parallels to reformed Viking feast culture, with their elaborate protocols designed to manage competitive national interests, while preventing the kind of spontaneous conflicts that could derail international negotiations. The G7 and G20 summits operate according to ceremonial procedures that would be familiar to any medieval feast coordinator. Careful attention to seating arrangements, elaborate gift exchanges, precisely choreographed social interactions, and the constant challenge of balancing competing egos while achieving practical objectives. What hasn't changed about human nature is the fundamental tension between the desire for authentic personal connection and the requirement for strategic political calculation that characterizes any situation where important business must be conducted through social interaction. Modern participants in high-stakes business dinners and diplomatic receptions experience the same basic challenges that confronted Viking feast participants: how to build genuine trust while pursuing competitive objectives, how to demonstrate strength without creating unnecessary conflicts, and how to navigate complex social protocols while maintaining focus on substantive goals. Similar patterns in different contexts appear throughout modern professional and social life. Academic conferences combine scholarly presentation with social networking in ways that replicate many features of Viking feast culture: competitive performance, designed to establish professional reputation, elaborate hospitality provided by host institutions, and complex social dynamics where personal relationships significantly influence professional opportunities. The success of academic careers often depends as much on conference social skills as on scholarly competence, just as Viking political success required feast performance abilities, alongside military and administrative talents. Wedding celebrations in modern Scandinavian countries preserve many structural elements of traditional feast culture, including elaborate gift exchanges, competitive entertainment, complex family negotiations, and the use of ceremonial dining to manage social relationships and demonstrate economic status. While the specific content has obviously changed, the underlying social functions and psychological dynamics remain remarkably similar to their medieval predecessors. Modern social media platforms represent a fascinating technological adaptation of feast culture principles, providing venues for competitive self-presentation, reputation management, and relationship building that serve many of the same functions as traditional social gatherings. The Instagram food post is essentially a digital version of the elaborate feast display, designed to demonstrate cultural sophistication and social status to a carefully curated audience of potential allies and competitors. Professional networking events explicitly acknowledge their debt to traditional hospitality customs, combining business objectives with social interaction in ways that attempt to recreate the relationship-building advantages of shared meals and entertainment. Modern event planners face many of the same challenges as medieval feast coordinators, managing diverse personalities, facilitating meaningful connections, preventing conflicts, and creating memorable experiences that will have lasting positive effects on participants' professional relationships. perhaps most significantly, modern leadership development programs often emphasize exactly the kinds of social and emotional intelligence skills that were essential for success in Viking feast culture. The ability to read group dynamics, manage competitive personalities, build consensus among competing interests, and maintain personal authenticity while pursuing strategic objectives. The persistence of these requirements across vastly different technological and cultural contexts suggests that certain aspects of human social organization remain remarkably consistent despite dramatic changes in the specific institutional forms through which they operate. Even now, Viking feast culture influences modern areas in ways that are often unrecognized but practically significant for anyone involved in high-stakes social and professional interactions. Academic study of medieval feast culture has contributed to modern understanding of how social institutions develop and change, providing insights that inform everything from organizational psychology to international relations theory. Researchers studying modern diplomatic effectiveness frequently reference Viking feast innovations as early examples of how personal relationship building can complement formal institutional mechanisms in achieving political objectives. Popular culture representations of Viking feasts have obviously departed dramatically from historical accuracy, but they continue to influence modern expectations about hospitality, authenticity, and social connection in ways that affect everything from restaurant design to corporate culture development. The persistent appeal of Viking-themed restaurants and entertainment venues reveals continuing fascination with the idea of more direct, authentic social interaction that seems to contrast with modern institutional formality. Political discourse increasingly emphasizes the importance of personal relationships and direct communication between leaders, reflecting assumptions about diplomatic effectiveness that can be traced directly to Viking feast culture's emphasis on face-to-face interaction and shared experience as foundations for political trust. Modern summit diplomacy operates according to principles that would be immediately familiar to medieval feast coordinators, even though the specific cultural context and technological capabilities have changed dramatically. Social movements advocating for more participatory and egalitarian approaches to organizational decision-making often draw inspiration from idealized versions of traditional Scandinavian social customs that include feast culture elements like consensus building, inclusive participation, and collective responsibility for group outcomes. While these modern applications obviously differ from their historical sources, they demonstrate the continuing relevance of social organizational principles that were originally developed and refined through centuries of feast culture experimentation. Why people still care about Viking feast culture today reflects broader contemporary concerns about authenticity, community, and meaningful social connection in an increasingly digitized and institutionalized world. The feast traditions represent an appealing alternative to modern social fragmentation and bureaucratic impersonality, providing historical validation for the idea that important business can and should be conducted through genuine human relationships, rather than purely formal procedures. The influence also appears in modern Scandinavian national identity, where references to traditional hospitality customs serve important functions in maintaining cultural distinctiveness within an increasingly globalized world. Contemporary Scandinavian approaches to everything from business culture to social policy continue to reflect assumptions about community, cooperation, and collective responsibility that were originally developed through feast culture's emphasis on managing group relationships and shared obligations. Looking back across the centuries of Viking feast culture we've explored together, we've seen a remarkable transformation from simple community gatherings into sophisticated political institutions that eventually became so complex they collapsed under their own elaborate protocols. The key patterns that emerged throughout this journey reveal how human societies consistently struggle with the same basic challenges: how to balance competition with cooperation, how to maintain authentic relationships while pursuing strategic objectives, and how to preserve cultural traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. Most surprising discoveries include the sheer sophistication of what we typically imagine as barbaric Viking culture, the extent to which these supposedly spontaneous feasts actually required professional management and elaborate preparation, and the remarkable persistence of certain social dynamics across dramatically different cultural and technological contexts. Perhaps most unexpectedly, we discovered that the same competitive instincts and relationship-building needs that characterized medieval Scandinavian feast culture continue to drive modern corporate entertainment, diplomatic summits, and social networking events. The most important takeaways from our exploration demonstrate how social institutions serve multiple functions simultaneously. Viking feasts weren't just about hospitality, entertainment, or political negotiation, but rather complex systems that attempted to manage all these functions together in ways that often created as many problems as they solved. The feast culture experience illustrates the fundamental difficulty of using social interaction to achieve political objectives, revealing tensions between authenticity and strategy that remain unresolved in modern contexts. How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey reflects the way that examining historical details can complicate and enrich our appreciation for past societies that are often reduced to simple stereotypes. The Vikings we encountered weren't the one-dimensional warriors of popular imagination, but rather complex individuals navigating sophisticated social institutions that required skills, ranging from culinary diplomacy to competitive poetry composition to strategic alcohol management. The broader themes that connected different aspects of feast culture include the persistent human need for social recognition and status, the challenge of managing group dynamics in high-stakes situations, and the way that traditional customs must constantly adapt to changing political and economic circumstances or risk becoming obsolete. We've seen how the same cultural values that created success in one context could become liabilities in another, and how solutions to social problems often generate new complications that require additional solutions. Perhaps most significantly, our journey through Viking feast culture reveals how historical change happens, not through dramatic revolutions, but through gradual adaptations and accumulated small decisions that eventually transform entire cultural systems. The decline of feast culture wasn't caused by any single dramatic event, but rather by the slow accumulation of factors that made traditional approaches less practical and effective than alternative institutional arrangements. The evolution of feast culture from traditional competitive gatherings to reformed ceremonial events to bureaucratic obsolescence demonstrates how cultural institutions must constantly balance preservation of essential functions with adaptation to changing circumstances. The Viking experience suggests that successful cultural adaptation requires maintaining core social purposes while remaining flexible about specific methods and procedures. Throughout our exploration, we've encountered the recurring theme that social institutions often work best when they serve multiple purposes simultaneously, but become vulnerable when those purposes come into conflict with each other. Viking feast culture succeeded when hospitality, entertainment, and political negotiation reinforced each other, but struggled when these different functions required contradictory approaches or incompatible social behaviors. Our final compelling anecdote brings us full circle to where we began, with a story that perfectly encapsulates all the themes we've explored through this remarkable journey into Viking feast culture. In 1247, nearly 2 centuries after the practical end of traditional feast culture, An elderly Icelandic chieftain named Snorri Sturluson hosted what would be remembered as the last authentic Viking feast in recorded history. This wasn't a nostalgic recreation or tourist performance. It was a genuine attempt to conduct serious political business, according to traditional protocols that had once governed all important Scandinavian affairs. The background to this final feast was both tragic and darkly comedic. Snorri was facing political exile and possible execution due to his involvement in complex Norwegian-Icelandic political disputes that could have been resolved through traditional feast diplomacy, if anyone still understood how such negotiations were supposed to work. Instead of accepting defeat through the formal legal and bureaucratic procedures that had replaced feast culture, Snorri decided to attempt one last traditional gathering that would either restore his political position or provide a spectacular final demonstration of what Scandinavian culture had lost through modernization. What happened next became the subject of the last great saga composition, though historians debate whether the account describes actual events or serves as a literary allegory for the end of traditional culture. According to the saga, Snorri invited representatives from all the major Icelandic families, plus Norwegian royal officials, to a feast that would recreate the competitive social dynamics that had once made such gatherings effective diplomatic venues. He hired the few remaining traditional entertainers, prepared foods according to recipes that hadn't been used for decades, and attempted to organize gift exchanges and poetry competitions that would allow participants to negotiate their political relationships through social interaction rather than formal procedures. But the participants had been so thoroughly trained in bureaucratic rather than traditional social protocols that they couldn't figure out how to participate effectively in the competitive feast dynamics that the event required. The Norwegian officials kept trying to turn conversations into formal legal proceedings, while the Icelandic representatives were more interested in networking for modern business opportunities than in engaging with traditional political theater. The professional entertainers found themselves performing for audiences who expected passive consumption rather than active participation, while the elaborate gift exchanges became awkward displays of wealth rather than meaningful political communication. The symbolic significance of this final feast was that it demonstrated how completely cultural knowledge could disappear within just a few generations. Skills and social understandings that had once been essential for political survival had become so obsolete that even people who wanted to preserve them couldn't successfully reconstruct their practical application. Snorri's feast revealed the gap between romanticized historical memory and the complex reality of functional cultural institutions. The evening concluded with what the saga describes as a moment of profound cultural recognition, when all the participants simultaneously realized that they were participating in a historical reenactment rather than a living tradition. Instead of conducting actual political business, they had become unwitting performers in an educational demonstration about their own cultural heritage. This recognition transformed the gathering from a political event into a shared meditation on cultural change and historical continuity. How this story connects to everything we've discussed is that it illustrates the fundamental challenge facing any society attempting to balance tradition with adaptation. Snorri's final feast wasn't just the end of Viking feast culture. It was a perfect example of how cultural traditions die not through dramatic destruction, but through gradual irrelevance that makes them impossible to sustain, even when people recognize their value and want to preserve them. And so we reach the gentle conclusion of our journey through the remarkable world of Viking feast culture, from its origins as simple community gatherings to its evolution into sophisticated political theater, and finally to its quiet transformation into historical memory. What we've discovered together is that these weren't just ancient dinner parties, but complex social institutions that reveal enduring truths about human nature, political organization, and cultural change. The appreciation for this journey extends beyond mere historical curiosity to recognition that understanding how past societies manage their social and political challenges can provide insights into our own contemporary struggles with authenticity, community, and meaningful connection in an increasingly complex and institutionalized world. The invitation to reflection comes naturally as we consider how the same basic human needs that drove Viking feast culture, the desire for recognition, the necessity of building trust, the challenge of managing competition while maintaining cooperation, continue to shape our modern social and professional lives. Though expressed through very different cultural forms and technological capabilities, our peaceful closing thought is that perhaps the most valuable lesson from Viking feast culture isn't about historical facts or cultural trivia, but about the persistent human capacity for creating elaborate, beautiful, and sometimes absurd social institutions in the eternal quest to make our shared existence more meaningful, manageable, and occasionally magical. The enduring appeal of these ancient gatherings reminds us that regardless of how sophisticated our formal institutions become, we remain fundamentally social creatures who need shared experiences, personal connections, and opportunities for recognition and belonging. Viking feast culture may have vanished as a practical political institution, but its underlying purposes persist in every modern context where people gather to build relationships, celebrate achievements, and navigate the eternal human challenge of living together in complex societies. In the end, perhaps the Vikings' greatest legacy isn't their military conquests or their impressive maritime achievements, but their demonstration that even the most practical political necessities can be transformed into opportunities for creativity, community, and collective meaning-making. Their feasts remind us that politics doesn't have to be purely instrumental, that hospitality can serve serious purposes, and that the most important business of human societies often happens not in formal institutions, but in the spaces where we gather to share food, stories, and the ongoing project of figuring out how to live together. Sweet dreams, and may your own gatherings, whether business dinners, family celebrations, or casual social events, carry forward something of the Viking spirit that recognized feast-making as both an art and a necessity, a source of joy and a tool for building the relationships that make civilized life possible.